and one thinker named Art Robinson, whom I like a lot, he argues that they're the greatest. There's a real case to be made for this, in the sense of what is Greenpeace's budget? It's a couple $100 million. I would like that budget. It's not a bad budget, but it's not that much, given for how much influence the green movement has. Same with Sierra Club. The real money promoting green is business money. They're promoting it to get along, and in many cases it's because some other business is on the chopping block, and they don't care, and they just, they just want to kind of go along to get along, or they feel like they can come up with, they can use green as a slogan, and it's very much not calculated, like they're really doing what's practical. There's so much guilt, and so they kind of feel like it's practical, but no one really buys it. I mean, no one buys that, for instance, Chevron is anti-oil, even though Chevron has all kinds of anti-oil. I mean, Chevron would obviously do much better for themselves by saying, like, these are all the amazing things that the oil industry brings to life, and we're proud of it. Instead, they say, we agree that we shouldn't use so much oil. Let's work together to get there. So let's work to kill us.
Have you seen actually their latest commercial? I don't know if anyone wants to watch too much TV, but a lot of the commercials they put on lately is like how they're funding education and all the positive things they're doing through the revenues they collect, And so I feel like they kind of have maybe gone away from their old message and now trying to put in like, hey, we're not so bad of a company.
But it's bad in what respect?
As in a lot of people, like, as soon as they hear oil company, oh, they're bad, but now they're trying to change their own, like I said, their own viewpoint that people have on them. They're trying to change it by saying, hey, without us, you'd be missing out on an extra $1 million in education or something like that.
But it's okay. But I mean, if someone had, was selling poison and it made billions of dollars and then gave a couple $1 million to education.
You mean like Ortho?
Well, but
oh wait, there's Chevron too, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not excited about that. But so in terms of, like, the question is there basic activity fundamentally good or bad? And if you try to justify yourself by something that's so ancillary, it's just a huge confession of guilt. And it just shows like you obviously have something to apologize for. If you don't see like you don't see before it went extinct, you didn't see like Solyndra. Oh, did you pass around the sign-up sheet, by the way?
Was that the
There were two sign-up sheets.
Oh,
Both are important. One is mine. So before Solyndra went extinct, you don't hear about all these solar companies doing like now they don't make any. They're not making too much money, but they don't talk about, oh, we spend all this on community education. Just like you don't hear the labor movement saying, oh, here's how we're helping everyone, because they don't feel guilty. So that's a good sign that they have the moral upper hand.
I think a perfect example is in the printing industry. Some years ago, there was all this fuss about changing to soy-based ink.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? All the volatile organic compounds in printing comes from the alcohol used in the printing solution, not the ink. The ink was based on the leftover of the refinery process. That's a heavy grease that doesn't evaporate. And so this change to soy-based ink is pure bullshit. Now, they've all changed to soy-based inks, and now they're paying the Forestry Stewardship Council and 3 or 4 other organizations to get a new printer that they're buying sustainable paper, which is the same paper they've always bought.
Yeah, but now they have all this recycled.
But they now have
they have all this recycled stuff, which is the same.
Well, the recycled stuff, actually the reason that printers didn't use recycled paper until they were forced to was that it didn't print very well.
Yeah, I know.
The process.
That's what I'm saying.
But they have they've improved the recycling process. But it's mostly for show. But then they advertise how green they are.
Right. But every little act of show sort of inculcates guilt and just makes this person makes just this national cult.
I mean, if somebody simply said, "Hey, wait a minute, the soy-based ink, we're going to devastate the Amazon rainforest to grow the soybeans," because that's exactly what they're doing. And here we're using a waste product from the refining process that ends up on the paper that eventually ends up sequestered in a landfill. Whereas now that's being burned in ocean-going ships as bunker fuel oil.
Yeah, so, yeah, there's a lot to say about that. That's an interesting example. You had a question?
Yeah, just based on back to the apologetic companies. I mean, the psyche of that we have of anti-oil, anti-big businesses, even penetrated big business and oil themselves. And it's like, it's not that what they need to say is they need to say that, hey, even if we didn't give all this money to education, even if we weren't charitable at all, you still need us. We're still not bad. Even if we didn't do all this stuff, we're an oil company, we're for profit, and we provide a product people want, and it's necessary for the industry. So, I mean, all this apologetic stuff is actually just aiding their own demise, saying, that, acknowledging that we agree with you, we're terrible people.
You can tell me whatever. I don't know what time you want it to end. I mean, I can go forever.
Yeah, we can go 8:45.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So finance is my thing, and I'm just wondering what kind of your take is on regulation in finance, if it should happen or what, to what extent, or I'm just curious to know what you think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, go to my website. One of my websites, alexepstein.com. It'll have more on this, but I'll give you just a quick
30 seconds.
quick sketch. Yeah, I mean, so it's I mean, our basic policy on the economy is a separation of state and economics. So the government's job is to prosecute force and fraud so that only voluntary relations occur among individuals. So in the banking system, this is what's called the free banking position, which is often called the gold standard, although it's not exactly the same. So free banking means that individuals form institutions or trade with each other and decide how do we exchange things. So they're allowed to barter if they want, but that's not very efficient. So they picked means of indirect exchange, and usually they pick gold, and then banks pick whatever policies. And if they commit fraud, they get prosecuted. Otherwise, people can do whatever they want. And that works to the extent that's occurred in history. It's worked very well. And to the extent the government has gotten involved in the economy, particularly in the business of printing money and or artificially lower interest rates, creates inflation, boom bust cycle, all that kind of thing. So something like the financial crisis on this view is this is a product of government interventions. It's a product of the Fed basically giving away a lot of free money, and then that money aggregating in the housing sector.
For the gold standard?
What's that?
Are you for the gold standard?
In essence, yes, but I'm for a freely chosen standard.
It seems like all the research says that that's the reason why the Great Depression lasted so long.
Because they had gold?
Yes.
Then why? I don't know.
You might want to read that research.
What?
You might want to read that research.
I have read that research. I wouldn't regard it as all the research or but it's an analysis anyway. It's not exactly research because you're attributing a cause. So you have a gold standard, right? So if you look at the proximate things that happened before the Great Depression, there's a kind of suspicious thing in 1913 called the Federal Reserve, which gets established. So it's been a gold standard for a while, and you've got throughout late 1800s, early 1900s, you've got a progressive amount of intervention by government.
Yeah.
So it's not a gold. That's why I stress the free banking aspect. It's not that you have this metal. The metal is a hell of a lot better than not having it. It's much better. I mean, now versus what we have, which is the government can print anything. So there's this issue of my colleague points out. I don't think this is his example, but he gave it to me. That what was it that I'm going to botch it, but it's something about like you can now. You can. There's been so much inflation that you used to be able to buy like a nice suit for $5, and now it's like $1,000. But the price of gold has like remained the same. So for the same amount of gold, you can buy a nice suit, except it's this massive multiple difference. So that means that the currency has been inflated. Now, what does that mean?
Oh, for sure. I'm not arguing.
I mean,
Right, but
supply is increased.
right, but it's important to understand that it's fundamentally redistribution that occurs when you inflate. Because look, if all of us had twice as much money in our wallets tomorrow, it wouldn't be that big a deal, right? It would just be a mathematical detail. if money entered the economy at the exact same rate, it would just be all equal. So the issue is, when you inflate the currency, it's someone wants money or someone is producing money for some purpose, and it goes to some people rather than others. So it's a redistribution mechanism. So in a housing boom, what happens is the money that's printed goes first to often a sector that's particularly hot among the banks. So you had real estate securitization and a housing bubble going on, partially because of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, so that was the one that happened then. Earlier you had dot-com companies.
Sure.
So, anyway, that's more than 30 seconds, but that's,
Well, inflation essentially steals from the saver and delivers to the borrower.
Sure.
yeah, that's a good.
So what happens is that
Sorry.
if you borrow, you benefit from inflation, and that's why the government uses inflation to monetize their debt. They don't have to pay it off.
Good point. Yes?
Yeah, my question that I asked during dinner, but being in a room full of libertarians as an objectivist, what's your opinion of the libertarian movement? Do you have a critique, or what do you think? I should say in a room full of mostly libertarians. I understand there's a lot of objectivists.
He asked me at dinner, I told him to plant it in the audience.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about it publicly. So I have no idea whatever. Unfortunately, I don't know what anyone's context is with regard to this issue, but there's a historical conflict between people who call themselves objectivists, which include me, and people who call themselves libertarians. And I just want to tell you how I think of this issue. So I regard the goal of everything in life is to be practical. So the reason I like Ayn Rand's ideas is because I believe understood correctly, they are practical and lead to good results. And to the extent that's not true, they should be jettisoned. So if I found something that I thought was impractical, I would disagree with it, and I would believe something else. So one issue that comes up a lot in life, and particularly in morality, is the issue of alliances. So whom do you associate with, and whom do you not associate with? And it's clear that in life it can be very beneficial to associate with people. So, for example, let's see. I mean, for example, Ayn Rand was around. I would love it if she would ask me to be her associate. She's a hero of mine and brilliant and could help me in all kinds of ways. And when I worked at the Ayn Rand Institute, I had coworkers who were very helpful to me. So that was a beneficial type of association. There's also such a phenomenon as people who are have something in common with you, but you don't want to have anything to do with them. So there are, for instance, racists who would call themselves pro-liberty, and I would call myself pro-liberty, but I would not get on a stage with them for obvious reasons. There are Nazis who would call themselves pro-liberty in different ways. I mean, so there's different people you want to associate with. So the question is, how do you know when to associate with someone? It can't just be they say they're for the same thing you are, because often that can be the worst sometimes. If someone says they're on your side, but then they really aren't on your side, or they really make it disreputable, then every time your position comes out, it becomes disreputable by association. So this came up historically with the issue of the term libertarian. So the term libertarian used to mean, way back in the day, classical, it more or less meant classical liberal. So if you look at Ayn Rand's book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, you look at the appendix of recommended readings, there's a lot of things at least a couple from libertarian press and stuff like that. It just meant someone who's in the general American tradition. Now on that, I would, if that were the modern meaning of the term, I would certainly say I'm in the libertarian tradition, just like I'll say I'm pro-liberty or I'm classical liberal. What happened though is that libertarian, you look like you're about to tear that up. No, please stop. To get back on. What happened was, Atlas Shrugged came out. Ayn Rand promoted her ideas of objectivism. Some people, including some people she's been associated with, started the modern libertarian movement taking some element, or saying they took some elements of her ideas, like we're against the initiation of force, and they blended it with, for example, the idea of anarchy. There should be no government. In her view, and in mine, this was an anti-liberty view. You cannot have, government is an enormous human issue. You can't have liberty without government. And along with that anti-government view was some truly bizarre positions. Just enormous amounts of anti-Americanism, championing the Soviet Union, championing Soviet Union-sponsored people in different countries, hatred of Israel, racist statements, which we now see with the whole, Ron Paul thing coming out of this whole legacy, which is Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell. So, people so anti-government, they would say that government has no role, and this is a big issue. I can point you to literature, but government has no role in, say, preventing child molestation. And they say, well, that's a voluntary act, the whole NAMBLA thing. This is a real issue in history. So you can see why Ayn Rand might not have wanted that term associated with her, and why people who agree with her philosophy didn't want to be associated with that term. At the same time, though, so there was an initial meaning, and then there was a certain meaning which became associated with formal institutions such as the Libertarian Party. And in the last decade or two, at least, I don't have the exact history, but it started to become a broader term. It's become a more popular term due to certain people, and it's become a term that many people whom I would regard as classical liberals designate themselves as. So for instance, so these aren't people I agree with on everything, but say people at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, to some extent the Cato Institute, people I work with, I write for a blog called Master Resource. Most of those guys would call themselves libertarians. And so it's now become kind of a meaningless term because it still encompasses, it has the classical liberal element, but there's still a major anarchist element, and it's still, in my view, I don't agree with the foreign policy views at all, and an anti-intellectual property view. So many things that I very strongly disagree with. That doesn't mean I won't talk to someone and explain my views on it, but it's not something I want to be identified as. But nor is it something that because it's such a hodgepodge, it doesn't make any sense to say, well, I will not associate with libertarians, because that has no referent anymore. It's just a blend of a bunch of incongruous things. So there were points at which people who were followers of Ayn Rand said, don't associate with libertarians under circumstances. I think chronologically it doesn't make sense as a statement anymore. But I would still not ally myself with those people who gave the term bad name. So when people ask me to be libertarian, I say, I don't like that term. You can call me, just call me laissez-faire, whatever. But I don't go out of my way to say I'm anti-libertarian, because words are used enormously for communication, and it's become a term that very good people identify with. So the key thing is just finding the right audience, finding among that people associated with the term, finding the right audiences and finding the right allies. And that really means people who basically hold pro-liberty ideas versus people who hold ideas that I think are antithetical and would be disreputable to me. So I would not have Lou Rockwell write my news articles. And I would be suspicious of someone who did let him say he never read them. Just like I'm suspicious of Obama for saying he never heard that Jeremiah Wright said goddamn America. Yes?
Along those lines, that just made me think of something as far as what objectivists would call ourselves in a political context. Like, for instance, people might ask me if I'm a libertarian, and I might say, well, I'm kind of like that, but not really, but you can sort of, or a lot of people say I'm a social liberal and a fiscal conservative, but that's really awkward.
Yeah.
Libertarian, I wouldn't want to exactly, it's becoming more of that blanket term, but it doesn't have a really specific meaning, and I would not want to be associated with NAMLA or Rockwell. So, I don't know, this is just kind of more of a open question.
So my view on this is, there's one question of what should a movement call itself? Because I don't think there's going to be like an objectivist party. I think it's going to be more of a catch-all, and I hope the objectivist ideas become more dominant, because that will make better policies, and I think it'll be more effective ultimately. But that's one question. I don't have a great answer to that. But when I want that, I just say, I'm for capital, pro-capitalism, laissez-faire. I don't think it's that important. But if you want to go for effect, if you want to be, you can actually make it interesting by saying some people say laissez-faire economics, hawk on national security, or something like that. Just interest, because an actually pro-liberty position, I think, in domestic and foreign policy will be interesting to people. It'll be this weird juxtaposition to them, even though to you it's consistent, and that people always like that kind of thing, because they think it's original. So it's not, but it serves your purpose if you want to make it clear. So you're allowed to say more than one word.
Right, it just seems like it'd be nice to have a label that.
This is a communication plan. You can't just make up new labels and expect people to get them. I mean, you can make a movement. I mean, I hope people say go industrial and whatever, but you can't just make up a party. So you have to realize what the context is, and once there's enough demand, someone will make up a label. It might not even be the one you like, but it's not that big a deal.
All right, I think we'll have to cut it off there, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Everyone, feel free to come talk.